we must absolutely ensure that this conflict does not spread to Syria and Lebanon and Iran as well, because that really could, with potential war in Europe at the moment, potential war in the Middle East, we will be back to the sort of 1939 scenarios. I think it was an unintentional strike on the targets that were killed, the people that were killed. I'm sure it was it wasn't an accident. So the Hermes 450, the drone operators who would have had a lawyer and a senior officer with them, presumably thought that they were attacking some Hamas fighters. However, they obviously got that wrong. So it was a dreadful accident. Well, a dreadful accident. They meant to do it. I absolutely hope and believe they didn't mean to kill these 3 Brits and the other 4 aid workers. But it's and I think it's important to point out. I used Hermes 450 in Afghanistan for a number of years. It is a very capable drone. It has very good cameras on it. However, the main camera they would be using at night is a thermal camera, black and white. Therefore, they would not have been able to read what was written on the vehicles, but they should have been able to identify absolutely the targets that they were aiming at. And the lawyers and the senior officers should have been there to make sure that nothing went wrong. This is a dreadful incident, but the fact that they have a process, the Board of Inquiry into this should be relatively straightforward, and they will have all the footage from the drone, and presumably there was another drone there as well and people on the ground. So it should be able to be resolved, relatively quickly if that's what the Israelis intended to do. I think, first of all, the cameras are good, but this is at night. So, which is when you expect people to take absolutely extra super care. Although this was an intentional attack, I don't believe it was the intention to kill 7 aid workers. But operating at night, first of all, the aid workers, would hopefully have known, and certainly the 3 security guys, the ex-British military people, will absolutely have known that operating at night is to be avoided at all possible. Hopefully they will also have known that the Israelis are conducting hundreds of these attacks, and that could well be part of the problem, that some of the rules of engagement maybe had been missed in this thing. Well, they must have been missed, otherwise these 7 innocent people wouldn't have been killed. I can see no reason at all to take out people who are delivering aid. So we must assume that it was a dreadful act, although intentional strike, a dreadful accident. And one more. Hopefully, they will learn from these things. But this is happening too often in Gaza. One absolutely understands the Israelis' requirement and desire to eliminate Hamas, but at the moment, more civilians are being eliminated than terrorists, and one just sort of thinks that needs to be looked at very carefully. Otherwise, it will unravel. I think the only other thing to consider as well that we're hearing is that there's so much political pressure on the Israeli military to get results that perhaps sometimes decisions are being made for political reasons rather than military reasons, and hence people are taking risks that have a dreadful consequence, as we've seen in this incident. The worst thing is obviously the families of those people who have been killed. But let's not forget, there have been thousands of civilians killed in Gaza. These are another 7 to add to that dreadful toll. We've seen the international condemnation, and I'm glad that Britain is really leading the way there, because that is the only way that the Israeli government will make sure that it is absolutely, completely surgical in its continuing battle to eliminate Hamas. But also it's very clear that aid is desperately needed in Gaza. And one would hope that the international community, the United Nations, as well as countries like the UK and the US, will work very closely with all agencies to get that aid in. Nobody is in any doubt that the Israelis have the right to eliminate Hamas, but for the vast majority of people in Gaza are innocent civilians who must be fed and protected as this operation goes on. Otherwise, the outcome is, in the long run, I'm sure, will be far worse for Israel than it should be. I think we're seeing a lot of reaction here, and the fact that the UN voted for a ceasefire only a few days ago, one would hope that that is enacted, pretty quickly. That has everybody's backing now, and that will allow really the aid to get in that needs to get in. What one absolutely accepts that Israel will keep pursuing Hamas, and they will do that, but at the expense of so many civilian casualties is really going against what they're trying to achieve, and also against stability in the Middle East. But the other issue to this, of course, is that the world is completely focused on Gaza at the moment. And as far as this country is concerned, actually what's happening in Europe with the Russians steaming into Ukraine is far more of a threat to this country, and we must not lose sight of that, as well as giving as much support as we can to aid workers and civilians, and to prevent further casualties like the dreadful ones that we've seen over the last few days. It's a really finely balanced position, and one accepts that. The US is Israel's closest ally and providing the majority of the military hardware for Israel to prosecute this war against Hamas. It is up to other countries like ourselves to ensure that the humanitarian side and protecting civilians in Gaza is absolutely at the top of the agenda. And that's what we should be doing. Whether Britain should be selling weapons to the Israelis, that level of detail I'm just not involved in or aware of. But the key thing is, I think everybody wants this conflict to be drawn to a close as quickly as possible, for Hamas to be neutralized, and for the 2 million plus innocent civilians in Gaza to be properly fed and looked after and helped to rebuild what has been a devastation for the Gaza Strip. I think Western leaders, including UK Prime Minister, are in a really difficult position because the dreadful headlines are all about Gaza at the moment, and that there is just as much that we can do, but we must not lose sight of what is happening in Europe, what is happening in Ukraine, and the threats coming out of Russia, because they could have a much bigger impact on the UK than what is happening in the Middle East. But allied to that as well, and it seems that obviously politics are driving this, and politicians are making decisions where perhaps military people should be doing it. But we must absolutely ensure that this conflict does not spread to Syria and Lebanon and Iran as well, because that really could, with potential war in Europe at the moment, potential war in the Middle East, we will be back to the sort of 1939 scenario. So it's challenging times, and our leaders must focus on that. There are many other pressures that they're worried about at the moment, cost of living crisis, climate change, all that sort of stuff. But actually, peace is the number one thing that should be at the absolute top of their agenda at the moment. And we can get to the other things once that's been resolved.